Yesterday, I went and watched the new Tolkien film in theaters, which is obviously about J.R.R. Tolkien and his early life. And for the most part, they did a pretty good job with the film. I didn't have too many complaints about the movie as far as how they portrayed his earlier life. They did a good job showing his relationship with Edith, who would eventually become his wife. They did a good job showing his relationship with TCBS, who were three young men who he went to school with, who were very positive influences on his life, and they really got along very well, and they kept in good relationship up until World War One, and they did a good job showing his experiences with World War One as well. And for the most part, I didn't have any complaints with how they portrayed this stuff, but unfortunately, there was a glaring mistake in this movie, something that was completely neglected from this movie, and it was so obvious to anyone who understands and knows who Tolkien was. It was very painful to watch, and that was his faith, his Christian faith. J.R.R. Tolkien was a devout Catholic. He was very devout to his faith. Anyone who knew Tolkien back then could testify to this, and he would show up to Mass every time, and he would always be there, and he was very influenced. His works were very influenced by his faith. He was a very strong person in his faith. His faith was who he was. And they completely removed that from this movie altogether. Completely. They pretended like that had nothing to do with who Tolkien was, and they completely pretended like it never happened. They pretended like Tolkien never had this faith. And that was the most important thing about Tolkien. His faith was the most important thing about Tolkien, and they completely removed it. Everything else they got pretty right in this movie, but they completely ignored who Tolkien really was in this movie. And that was a huge problem with this movie, and honestly, that is a huge problem with Hollywood in general. They want to pretend like Christianity doesn't exist. Either that, or they want to portray Christianity in a bad light. One of those two options are the only ways that Hollywood likes to portray Christianity nowadays. Unfortunately, they couldn't show Tolkien's Christian faith in a positive light in this movie, because that would be just terrible, right? How dare you show Christianity in a positive light, or even a neutral light? So that wasn't an option. So they decided that the only other option that they had was to completely pretend like it didn't exist at all, and that's exactly what they did with this movie. I don't know where the director stands on this. I don't know what his background is. I don't know what he thinks about Christianity or Catholicism or anything like that. So I can't really speak on what the director was thinking when he decided to completely cut this out. But it was obvious that was what Hollywood wanted. They wanted to show Tolkien without showing who he really was, because they don't want to acknowledge the fact that his faith was a huge part of who he was. Unfortunately, that was completely missing, and that was the biggest thing about Tolkien that they should have gotten right, was his faith, because his faith was such a huge influence on who he was and on his works. Even Beowulf, if I'm not mistaken, his adaptation of Beowulf, I believe in the intro to Beowulf, he talks about how his faith influenced how he wrote, retold Beowulf or whatever, reimagined Beowulf. And, that was completely missing from this movie altogether. And it's just so obvious to anyone who's actually paying attention that Hollywood is trying to pretend like Christianity doesn't exist, or they're trying to paint it in a bad light, and it's just continuing to get worse and worse as far as that aspect goes. So I just wanted to make you guys aware about this, because I recommend you guys going to check out the film. If you haven't checked it out, I do recommend going to check it out, especially if you want to know more about who Tolkien was. But just understand that they are cutting out the who the core of Tolkien was in this movie. So I would recommend going to see this film, and then I recommend you look up some biographical stuff about Tolkien and understand who he was on your own, because this film is pretty inaccurate when it comes to the core of who Tolkien was. Like I said, the basic life events of Tolkien's life, they got pretty much right for the most part, but overall, definitely was a huge issue with this film, and it's a huge issue in Hollywood in general. So with that being said, and let me just also add, I don't even care if they necessarily portray Tolkien's faith in a positive light. Even if they just portrayed it in a neutral light, I would have been totally fine with that. You don't have to, make this a preachy film or anything. Just acknowledge the fact that was who he was. Show his faith, even if it's in a neutral light, so that you can acknowledge that that was who he was, and without that faith, Tolkien would not be who he was, and he would not be the author that he was. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for all of your support, and I will talk to you all very soon in another video. Talk to you later. Bye.